The Drinks Adventures podcast is proudly supported by our friends at Bintani, Australia's leading supplier of ingredients for the brewing and distilling industries. Bintani has all the ingredients you need, and they have experts in all categories on the team, so they understand how ingredients work together like no other supplier. Bintani handpicks the best. I'm James Atkinson, and this is Drinks Adventures, the podcast where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and explore trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Welcome to the final episode of Season 2 of the Drinks Adventures podcast, and there'll be more on that at the end of the show. This time I'm joined by Jared Brown, who is Master Distiller of London's Sipsmith Gin. But that's not what we're talking about today, because Jared has another far more interesting title, that of Cocktail Historian. With his wife Anistatia Miller, Jared has written more than 30 books on drinks, bars and cocktails. I knew from interviewing him on one previous occasion that he's an absolute encyclopaedia on these topics and a fascinating fellow to chat to. So I jumped at the chance to do just that when Jared was last in Sydney. It's a very entertaining interview, and you can enjoy it right after this message from another one of our valued sponsors. This episode of Drinks Adventures is proudly sponsored by Fever Tree Premium Mixers. Fever Tree pioneered the world's first premium tonic water, made only with naturally sourced ingredients, and today it's served in 9 out of 10 of the world's top restaurants. Fever Tree Tonic, because if 3/4 of your G&T is tonic, make sure you mix with the best. Jared Brown, thanks so much for joining me on the Drinks Adventures podcast.
Wonderful to be here with you.
You are a master distiller, but also a cocktail historian. Now, I can imagine that wasn't really a very established career path before you embarked on it.
Well, that was an accident. 1995, the wife and I were travel writers ensconced in Vancouver, BC, where we wrote 6 books about the area. And a friend of ours said, hey, you know this internet? I think it's going to be big. You should get on it, build a website. Halloween night, the wife sat in front of the computer. I walk in, she says, what should we build a website on? I was holding 2 martinis. We put up a martini website, expecting to get at least a dozen visits, 2,500 emails that first month, which back then, that kind of traffic was enough to crash our service provider 4 times. The site snowballed in 6 months. A young editor from HarperCollins Publishers in New York, Jeremy Ruby Strauss, emailed and said, I love your website. I want to turn it into a book. And that was how the world's best-selling book on the martini, Shaken Not Stirred, was born. Came out in '96. It's done 500,000 copies. But before we would let that website go out as a book, we ensconced ourselves in the rare book rooms at Vancouver Public Library, New York Public Library, into the historic archives in San Francisco, etc., to ferret out as much as we possibly could on the martini.
You busted a lot of myths along the way. I was reading before this interview about, for example, the origins of the word mixology, which has been credited to Dale de Groff, but apparently you discovered that it had a much earlier application than that. And funnily enough, Dale de Groff was just in Australia, and people are still saying that, you know, that it was him who came up with the word.
He was a precocious kid then, because I did find it used in print, and I believe defined already in 1948 or thereabouts. I used to bug them monthly, Webster's Dictionary online, and they used to promise they'd fix this, but after about 3 years, they've still got it credited to like Dale de Groff in 1987 or something.
Well, I thought it went back to even earlier than that, maybe. The 19th
mixologist.
Century. Ah, right,
Mixologist goes back to June of 1857, I believe it was, and it was the Knickerbocker Monthly magazine, a pseudonymous writer called himself Mace Sloper. I give it about a 92% chance that that was actually Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, who was writing for them. And he used it as a disparaging term. You know, anyone who would call a barkeep a mixologist of particular fixings has a waxed handlebar mustache, a a moleskin vest and a very high impression of himself.
Now it's probably not used as a put-down like that.
Now it's simply used interchangeably, but to apply to someone who is devoting themselves to more than just slinging drinks, to someone who's really diving in. And it does have a bit of a scientific ring to it, a professorial ring to it. And I don't think that's inappropriate. I think that's pretty spot on for a lot of the guys who are out there with a rotavapor just to work out a top note in their house bitters and that sort of thing. They're not really just a barkeep.
When we last caught up, which was in 2015, you were welcoming the return of simplicity to cocktail making. Has that continued? We're 3.5 years later now.
I am seeing a lot more simplicity coming up. My guiding quote in all that I do comes from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, author of The Little Prince, who said, "Perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away." And that really guides the structure of making products that I make, making drinks, designing cocktails, menus, even venues. So yes, I am actually seeing a lot of places where they're cutting back on the gratuitous ingredients.
Are there any specific trends that you're seeing that sort of embody this move back towards simplicity?
Definitely. In recent years, even in Japan, they were just re-embracing the highball. And now the highball is everywhere. I was sitting in a restaurant here in Sydney the other night, and I glanced over and I saw somebody drinking a highball. And then I looked around and I realized half a dozen people in the room were having whiskey highballs. Just whiskey and soda. Perhaps a bit of lemon, frozen mug, and a couple of ice cubes.
Maybe you could tell us about where the highballs come from originally.
The history of the highball is still murky, I'll say that. The best of the knowledge that we've got did come out of America, and it took its name from railroad signals, where there's literally a big metal sphere that was next to the track. If it was sat low, you had to stop the train and wait because it meant there was an oncoming train. When it went up, that meant it was all clear. You had a highball, all systems go, and the bars along the rail lines began serving drink. Ice cube floating up in that, it was all systems go.
You seem to be very much drawn to classicism and classic cocktails and uncovering drinks the way that they used to be made. Are there any contemporary trends that are genuinely new that you're really happy to embrace?
Yes, there are some, but there are a lot that we're eventually going to discover they did 150 years ago as well, one way or another. Of course, they still had to abide by seasonality and regionality. And one of the most interesting trends I'm seeing today in this world where we can have the same rum and coke in every bar on the planet is reaching back to that seasonality and regionality, that localism that previous generations gratefully gave up to have what they're having across the world. Now, have what's right here, right now, in season. And that is what makes things truly special these days. And it's great to see that intruding rapidly behind the bar as well.
What are some of the examples of the bars that are really championing that approach?
Oh.
In Sydney we have, I don't know if you've been to Bulletin Place, but they have a seasonal cocktail menu. They come in and write up the cocktail list based on, what ingredients they have on hand at that particular time.
No, I haven't checked that one out. Actually, the first one that came to mind was a little bar in the west of England called the Dark Horse on Kingsmead Square in Bath, which is all about seasonal and local. But that's my wife's bar. And she and her business partner, Louise-Ave Lewis-Smith, they've just opened a second one in Bristol called Crying Wolf. And both of those focus entirely on this, which is a problem for me because it means I'm losing all the currants from my garden for her creme de cassis for the bar. Any amount of cider that I produce from the garden, it disappears eventually off to the bar, though right now she's waiting anxiously because I'm putting in another rotavapor in the house, a vacuum still. And she's got her eye on the cider just because she needs to extract a couple of notes from it.
Tell me about the new house, because you just told me you've moved, you've been living in the Cotswolds for a few years and now you've moved to a new location.
We were really fortunate to find this 400-year-old thatched cottage on an acre out in the countryside that we could actually afford. In 25 years of marriage, we finally got a toehold on the property ladder. And what a toehold. The previous owner lived there 30 years, all his adult life. And when he wasn't on the road touring as Peter Gabriel's lead guitarist, he was keeping himself sane by throwing himself into the garden, planted 40 fruit trees, which are all now mature. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, quinces, medlars, all rare heritage species thereof. He planted 2 kinds of hops, so I've got a huge harvest of early bird and fuggle going, plus wild hops that comes up all around the property from when it was cultivated there a century or 2 ago.
What are you doing with the hops?
Oh, I bring it into the office and hand it over to my production team, and they hand me beer back. It's a very effortless exchange.
It hasn't ended up in gin yet?
It's ended up in so many different gins, and you know what? It breaks one of my fundamental rules. There's a simple question that I work with of no matter how interesting the idea, how historic the concept, how trend-setting, it's got to answer the question, is it good? Is it good? You know, could someone who has no idea what it is sit down and have 3 of them in a bar? Or will they need a load of explanation up front to have one, and then they'll say, oh, that was interesting, can I have a beer? The sound of ultimate failure. And hops, at least to my experience, has always come across badly in distillation.
Now, when you and Sam and Fairfax sat down and made the decision to resurrect London Dry Gin as it had originally been made, gin was in a very different place then to what it is now. You must look at what you've achieved with Sipsmith and say, well, job done. Are there any other underrated or misunderstood spirits that you think are due for a comeback?
Wonderful question. There's one that I've been championing for quite a while, but I think it's nearly job done there as well, and that's vermouth.
I've heard your vermouth rant before, and I was going to get onto that, actually.
Yeah, it's a fairly extensive rant on vermouth, because vermouth was absolutely disrespected, misunderstood. There were a few misquotes out there. Winston Churchill liked his martini so dry that he would just bow toward France with his glass of straight gin, and that was enough. Or Noel Coward would raise his glass of straight gin toward Italy. And from what I understand, both of them did those motions, but not for the reasons they're credited with. During the war, the Vichy government was prohibitionist, so there were no vermouth exports out of France. Italy, Mussolini was teetotal. There were no vermouth exports out of Italy. Churchill and Coward were raising their glasses toward those countries not because they didn't like vermouth, but in the hopes the vermouth would one day return to their martini, that product they couldn't get at the time. And so that was as close as they could get to having it there.
But not only that, it's been a badly mistreated drink by bars.
Oh, I thought we'd seen the last one thing, and then I was in Les Arcs in the French Alps or maybe it was Geneva Airport, and behind the bar in this little airport panini shop, I saw a couple of bottles of martini, of dry and rosso, on the back bar with pour spouts, speed pours stuck with them, or stuck in them, breathing. You open a Chateau Margaux, you perhaps let it breathe for 20 minutes. you serve it. If you leave it to breathe for another 6 months, it's dead, it's compost, it's breathed, it's rotted, it's died. And I just picked the Chateau Margaux because it's about 0.2% ABV off of Martini. They used to be identical, and then Martini beefed theirs up that tiny bit, but yeah, vermouth is a wine. Breathes, rots, dies. People ask me which is my favorite vermouth. I'll inevitably say the freshest one. My two favorite sounds in a bar, the pop of a champagne cork and the crack of the seal on a fresh bottle of vermouth, because that means the martinis, the Manhattans, will be the best they can possibly be in that bar.
How fast does it degrade?
You can definitely notice the difference within about a week if it's sat with just out and closed. If it's sat with a pour spout in it, it's really gone in a week. A recent study on this showed that not just vermouth, but any wine can be maintained 10 to 15 times longer by putting it into the fridge when not in use. So for a busy bar, sure, pour spout in during service, but keep it someplace cool. And then after service, cap it into the fridge. You're still extending the life up to about 7 to 10 weeks.
There's a lot of new vermouths coming onto the market. Are they being done as well as... I know you're a fan of the Martini Vermouths.
The newer ones, you'll find young bartenders, young producers get this idea that more is more. And where a drop was concerned, it becomes a dash, it becomes a dollop. And I find if I'm mixing with some of the newest vermouths, I can't add bitters because they're already bittered over that point. Because, sure, I understand that there's a love for playing around with the botanicals, but one of the most important things in making vermouth is to remember it is a wine. And add botanicals only to the point where it still highlights the wine and not the botanicals.
One of the biggest trends in the world of distilling, and in your particular arena of distilling, is pink gin. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I love a good Pinkers. A hot afternoon, just that bit of gin and Angostura bitters. Stir it down, remarkably savory. It really doesn't look pink. Oh wait, you're not talking about that, are you? You're talking about these bright pink. Color doesn't occur in nature.
Not a fan of the contemporary, if you want to call it that, pink gins that we're seeing on the market now that are strawberry or whatever led.
I really like anyone that is still juniper led, because if it's not juniper led, it's not gin. And it's just wearing the gin badge because gin is popular.
You've talked about how over the course of history, the availability of drinks to bartenders has shaped the history of cocktails at the time. Your country is currently going through Brexit. Could that have an impact on the cocktail scene in the UK?
Oh, Brexit has definitely had a load of different impacts already. One, I seem to be producing a fair bit of gin for Parliament. I'm actually the distiller for House of Commons.
Yeah.
And I make a bespoke gin for that building. It was a lot of fun making a classic London dry for a single building, old stone building on a river. So I made it for a space that was cold, damp, and mineral. I gave it a touch of warm wood paneling, deep carpet, and a bouquet of flowers in the corner, botanically. And you get just this veneer of mahogany in the background as you're having your martini. So it's little details like that that I get to play around with that one building. And yeah, I was over there, I think budget day before last, pouring myself, or not for myself, for them. And yeah, quite a few takers.
The amount of time they're spending in there at all hours, maybe a spike in sales, I would have thought too.
Oh, definitely, but not just in Parliament, but in Britain widely, no matter which side you're on, exit or remain. It's driving a lot of traffic into bars right now because people could definitely use a drink in the midst of this madness.
When we last met up, you were telling me about your recent creation at the time, which was meat smoked gin. Now, with this array of this cornucopia of ingredients that you've got in the yard there in the Cotswolds, has there been anything else that you're working on that's going to be equally surprising for people?
This year, I'm really hoping to have a bumper crop of red and green shiso, which the wife turns into shiso syrup for our drinks, but then she'll freeze it into cubes, and she can get the shiso syrup frozen into cubes so that you drop one into the shaker when you're making a gimlet. Give it a really hard shake, and people will load up the normal gimlet fixings, but if you've dropped a red shiso cube in there, you strain it out, and the drink has gone red. And beautiful flavor from that. I'm just getting my Artemisia game back up and running. This year, I hope to grow Artemisia absinthium, pontica, Genepi, Artemisia alba, the Moroccan mountain wormwood, working, again, towards some vermouth thoughts, but also you can take a sprig of this, drop it into a bottle of gin, leave it for 24 hours exact, take it out, and you've really hit the zen of the martini cocktail of that gin and wormwood. That one came out of Jerry Thomas's 1862 book. But dearly love playing around with that. I've also got a load of walnut liqueur on the go, mucking around with that. And then I've gone back to what I did at age 10, which was actually doing freeze distillation, where to make that apple brandy, I was using a technique that used to be called jacking, and this is where Applejack came from, of taking that cider and putting it out in the snow overnight. In the morning, lift out all the ice, put it back out, lift out the ice, put it back out. So the wife and I have committed a few liters of cider to producing that. And then another bunch, I've still got apples from the last harvest in the deep freeze to work on an ice cider.
Fantastic. And you and your wife, Anistatia Miller, you've got quite the canon of literature on drinks. I mean, I think there's 30-something books or something like that.
That's my count.
What are you working on now?
Actually, last night, if I sound a little fuzzy today, it's because 2 o'clock in the morning, I just put my computer down doing some, what I thought was final edits on Sip 100 gin cocktails with only 3 ingredients, which, though it's aimed at consumers, it's got a lot of history that has never been released before. It does correct the history of gin. Gin didn't come over from Holland after the 30 Years' War as Genever, and it wasn't that King William of Orange launched Genever and it eventually evolved into gin. In researching this book, I found that in London, they were already working juniper-led, Spanish orange and lemon peel backed and spice supported. I mean, that's my London dry recipe right there. Should not exist in 1600. There's a bunch of correcting Wikipedia that's going to be done when this book comes out. Origins of a bunch of cocktails as well. Oh, I had fun with it.
Well, Jared Brown, I think I'll let you get about your day. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. It's been a real pleasure as always. Good to speak with you.
There you have it, Jared Brown. There really are so many more questions I would have liked to ask him, but they'll have to wait until another day. And if you're interested in hearing more about Sipsmith Gin, go back to Season 1, Episode 2, where I spoke with co-founder Fairfax Hall about the many interesting things going on in the gin category at present. Now, as mentioned, this is the last episode of Season 2. We're already working on some new content and we should be back bigger and better very soon with Season 3. So stay subscribed and that way you'll be the first to know when we make our return. In the meantime, I'd love to receive any feedback you may have. Just email hello@drinksadventures.com.au and let me know what you thought of this season. Thank you to our major partner Bintani, Australia's leading supplier of ingredients for the brewing and distilling industries, and thanks also to Fever Tree Premium Mixers for their support of the Spirits episodes in this season. I've had a lot of feedback that people loved the documentary format of the Stone and Wood episode, For those who have just joined us in Season 2, it's not a new format for the podcast. There were 3 documentaries with a similar format in Season 1. Those were the episodes on Japanese sake, champagne and Willie Smith cider, so I strongly suggest you check those out. And thank you finally to Dave Robertson for all his hard work in putting this show together. We'll see you again soon for Season 3 of Drinks Adventures. But before I go, a reminder that you can support the Drinks Adventures podcast by purchasing a limited edition set of drink coasters featuring artwork created by Barry Patternord. There are only 100 sets of these Drinks Adventures pod coasters, as we will be calling them. Each set has 4 unique coasters, each with a specially commissioned illustration that brilliantly catches the vibe of what the show is all about. By purchasing a set of pod coasters, you'll really be supporting us to keep producing the show, which we love doing. And you'll have some awesome limited edition drink coasters that will not be made again. Go to drinksadventures.com.au and at the top of the homepage, you can check out Barry's awesome designs and find out how to purchase your set of pod coasters. Thank you in advance for your support of the Drinks Adventures podcast. The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at @ByJamesAtkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.